Hi everyone, so today we'll look at group ambiguity. What is it? Why should we care about it? And then we'll take a look at some real life examples in which ambiguity plays a really important role in how we choose to make choices in our lives. Okay, so let's take a look at this whole notion of group ambiguity. Let's say I said something like the following. De Anza college students drink more beer than Foothill college students. Can you see how that statement is ambiguous? Can you see how there may be more than one way of understanding what is said? So if I said to you, De Anza college students drink more beer than Foothill college students, does that mean that on average, the student at De Anza drinks more beer than a student at Foothill on average? So maybe a De Anza student on average drinks 2 beers a weekend, and the Foothill College student on average drinks 1 beer per weekend. Now, is that what I mean? Or do I mean that if we were to sum up the amount of alcohol consumed by De Anza college students, that it will be greater than the total amount of alcohol consumed by a Foothill College student? If that were the case, then the population size matters a lot, right? If De Anza has twice or 3 times more students than Foothill, then to say they drink more than Foothill College students doesn't really say much. If we're talking about the average alcohol consumption of each individual student, then that might be a little more interesting information. Yeah, but the claim is, hopefully you see, ambiguous, and the ambiguity is a result of grouping. So we talked about ambiguity in terms of syntax. We talked about ambiguity in terms of semantics. And what we saw just now is an example of grouping ambiguity. This is when it is unclear if somebody is referring to a group of things collectively or individually. If I said to you, attorneys make less money than physicians, are we talking about the entire population of attorneys as a group make less money than the total group of physicians? Again, that means the number of attorneys versus number of physicians plays a part in there, right? Or are we talking about like average salary? That the average salary for an attorney, the average amount of money an attorney makes, is less than the average amount of money a physician makes. That would be talking about the individuals, individual attorneys, individual physicians. If I said something like 7 people rode in that taxi, are we saying that throughout the day, this taxi picked up, 7 different people, so that he had 7 different clients, each of them separately? Or are we saying that when at some point in the day, when you opened up the door to the taxi, you'd find 7 people in it, right? Are we talking about the group? Or are we talking about individuals? It's ambiguous. It's not clear. If we said something like, which causes more air pollution, lawnmowers or motorcycles? Well, we don't really know what's being referred to here. Are we saying that on average, right, an individual lawnmower creates more pollution than an individual motorcycle on average? Or are we saying that the total amount of air pollution caused by lawnmowers may be larger than the total amount of pollution caused by motorcycles? We're not sure what the question is asking us to compare because of grouping ambiguity. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if we can get a sense for when somebody might be referring to a group versus when they might be referring to an individual. This requires us to take a look at the context, take a look at what we know about what's being said, and to come up with a common sense sort of interpretation of whether or not somebody's referring to the group or the individual. So let's take a look at exercise 3-8 on page 97. And I'd like you to take a look at numbers 2, 3, 8, 9, and 11. Is the statement based upon context and based upon just kind of common sense, do you think they're referring more likely to groups or individuals? So pause the video, try your hand at those exercises, and then unpause the video, and then let's go and try to see if you came up with the correct answers. So number 2, professors at the university make millions of dollars a year. Now, is that statement referring to the group or the individual? I don't know any professor that makes millions of dollars a year personally. If you know the university that gives out that much in salary, let me know and I'll go apply right away. It's more likely that the statement is referring to the group. So that when we take a look at that university, the total amount of money earned by professors, you add up all their salaries, would be millions of dollars, right? Highly unlikely we're talking about individual professors. Number 3, our amplifiers can be heard all across the country. So you can imagine you're like an amplifier company and you're trying to talk about how awesome your amplifiers are, and you make the statement, our amplifiers can be heard all across the country. Are they talking about the group of amplifiers, or are they talking about individual amplifiers? It's very unlikely that a company will say that their amplifier that's located in San Diego can be heard all the way in New York City, right? So probably not individual amplifiers. It's more likely referring to how the company has amplifiers all over the country, right? So in this sense, as a group, they can be heard all across the country. An individual amplifier that's loud enough, one individual amplifier that's loud enough to be heard across the country, you do not want to be standing next to. All right, number 8. On our airline, passengers have their choice of 3 different meals. Is it referring to the group of passengers or individual passengers? Unless we are boarding a really, really cheap airline that only has 3 meals to be shared amongst all the passengers, chances are they are referring to individuals, right? That each individual passenger can choose between 3 different meals. Number 9, on our airline, passengers flew 14 million miles last month without incident. Do you know anybody that flies 14 million miles in a month? Probably not. So the statement is more likely referring to a group, meaning when we take a look at this airline and we take a look at all of their passengers the previous month, all of them together, when we look at all the miles they traveled, combined should be 14 million, right? Probably talking about the total amount of miles traveled per group, for a group, for their group, without incident within the last month. Probably not referring to how there was somebody that traveled 14 million miles. Let's take a look then at number 11. All our cars are on sale for $200 over factory invoice. Are they talking about the group of cars or individual cars? So to think of it as group would be to say, you take a look at all the cars on this lot and you total up how much they're being sold for in total, and that amount is just $200 more than how much this lot paid for all the cars. Well, that's not a lot of money to be earning from selling cars. So rather than group, it's more likely they're talking about individual cars, right? That each car is on sale for $200 over factory invoice. Okay, hope that made some sense. It's these sorts of ambiguities are a matter of being able to see how somebody can be confused, being able to see multiple ways of interpreting a statement. So if they weren't obvious to you at first, that's okay. What's important, though, is that when we speak, when we try to articulate our argument, that we are wary or aware that there are more than one ways in which people can interpret us. And then when we hear other people speak and we try to understand their argument, we should be careful that we don't come to a conclusion based upon maybe our misinterpretation of what they are saying. So with the idea of group ambiguity comes certain related fallacies. Now, fallacies are simply mistakes in reasoning, where we think something makes sense, that there's some rational way that we get from point A to point B, when in fact it really isn't rational. So these are fallacies. So when we are looking at an argument, we should be careful of group-related fallacies. The first one we'll talk about is the fallacy of division. Now, this fallacy is when we come to a conclusion that what is true of a group is also true of all the parts that make up the group, which isn't true, right? If I said to you, our country is the wealthiest in the world, so you must be richer than everyone in France, hopefully you just take a look around you or look at your own pockets and wallets and notice that, that's not true. Just because our country is the wealthiest in the world, that just means we have the most money, but it doesn't mean every individual has more money than every individual in every other country, right? So what's true of the group isn't necessarily what's true of all the individual things that make up the group. If I said to you something like, in 2011, the New York Giants were the best team in football. Let's say they won the Super Bowl. So Eli Manning must have been the best quarterback in football. We're making the same sort of fallacy, right? Just because the group, the Giants, were the best team doesn't mean that all the parts that make up the team is better than all the other parts and all the other teams, right? If you are a basketball fan and someone said to you, hey, the Toronto Raptors just won the NBA championships, they were the best team in basketball, therefore, the player that was on their bench that never played a minute in the championships must be better than any other player in any other team. Well, that makes no sense. Okay, so what's true of the group isn't necessarily true of the individuals. If I said to you something like, De Anza is a great school, so all De Anza students must be great, you probably know from personal experience that may not be the case. It could be, but it's not an argument, right? Just to say something is great, a group is great, doesn't mean all the things within the group are as great, right? Or greater than other things in other groups. All right, hopefully that makes some sense. Another fallacy is the fallacy of composition, and this is in reverse now. That is to conclude that what is true of the individual parts is true of the group, right? So just because some characteristic or trait is true of the individual parts doesn't mean that that characteristic applies to the whole. So if I said to you, a car makes less pollution than a bus, therefore cars are less of a pollution problem than buses, I'm making this fallacy. And people make fallacies like this all the time, especially in politics when they're trying to support a certain viewpoint, right? A car makes less pollution than a bus. So individually, each car, well, they're smaller vehicles than buses. So yeah, individually, they produce less pollution than a bus individually. But in terms of, how do we address the problem of pollution? Well, there's a lot more cars in the world, right? And the total number of cars, because the number of cars is so great, cars in general produce a lots of pollution, right? So obviously, you hopefully can see that this argument really doesn't work. If I said to you, well, atoms are colorless, this is what we're told by physicists, atoms have no color. Well, cats are made out of atoms, so cats are colorless. That should be obviously an incorrect sort of leap in logic, right? Just because atoms are colorless doesn't mean the things that atoms make up are also colorless. So what's true of the individual part isn't necessarily true of the whole. If you said to somebody, I love my dog Spot, so I must love all dogs. Well, you might love all dogs, but it's not necessarily a conclusion that can be made from saying you love your dog Spot, right? If you said Jamie loves her cat Craig, therefore Jamie must love all cats, well, that's not necessarily true, right? What's true of the individual is not true for the group. At least it's not necessarily true for the group. Now, that sort of argument isn't a very good one. All right. So, the problem with ambiguity isn't just something we read about in textbooks that we're learning in our class. Like we mentioned a second ago, people will intentionally be ambiguous to prove their point, or they will, or we can be misled to make choices that maybe we don't want to make because we make the wrong interpretation of data or the wrong interpretation of what's being said to us. So if I said to you the average price of a new house in this neighborhood is $1 million, well, that sounds relatively high. Maybe not so high where we live in Silicon Valley, but just about anywhere else on in the country. I mean, that seems pretty high, that the average price of a new house in this neighborhood is $1 million. So maybe if your agent says this, you just don't even look at that neighborhood anymore, right? Wow, on average, it's $1 million. I can't afford $1 million home, so I won't even look at that neighborhood. But you have to think about average, right? The word and how it applies to housing prices, well, there's lots of different ways of interpreting that. So you could have a house in a neighborhood with an average, price of $1 million. You could have a house there that's like $100,000, but then every other house in the neighborhood is just you're really expensive. Or you can have just about every house in the neighborhood being relatively cheap, but then one house in the neighborhood, that's worth a lot of money, and then on average, then we see $1 million. So when we think about things like this for housing prices, what's more maybe useful is to find out things like the mode, right? And so if you take a look at the houses within the neighborhood, is there a certain value that comes up more often than any others? So something to consider when you are purchasing a house. Politics, right? There was a interviewer who famously asked a political candidate, presidential candidate, why don't you support gay marriage? And then the candidate, John Edwards, said, well, I guess it was the way I was brought up. Now, the candidate, answered the question using his own interpretation of the question, but really the question is ambiguous. Tim Russert asks, but why don't you support gay marriage? It's not explicit what it is he is asking for. Is he asking for the cause for not supporting it? Is he asking for an explanation of where this non-support came from? In which case, the candidate actually did address that, right? The candidate did tell us, what the cause was for his non-support, or the explanation for where that comes from. But more likely, Russert was really asking for an argument. What is your argument for not supporting it? Now, if you're a political candidate, you're going to, and things are ambiguous, if you have ambiguous questions like that, you're always going to want to interpret the question in a way that you can answer it that's most beneficial to you, right? And this is something to watch out for when we take a look at politics. Speaking of politics and issues, lots of people read the Constitution and notice, that there is lots of ambiguity. In political debate, a hot topic is gun control. There's lots of ambiguity when it comes to the Second Amendment. So here is a statement from the Constitution. A well-regarded militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There's lots of ways of interpreting this sentence, and people will interpret it usually based upon how they want to view gun rights and gun laws. What is it they want? So this statement, hopefully you can see, is pretty ambiguous. Can you see a grouping ambiguity here? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to bear and keep arms shall not be infringed. The right of the people, does that refer to the collective right, as in the right of the country to keep and bear arms? Or does that refer to the individual right, that each individual has a right to keep and bear arms? It's not clear. There's vagueness involved. Keep and bear refers to what exactly? Does it refer to bringing a gun to class because the Constitution says you can keep and bear your arms? I mean, where does it exclude any particular place? Can you keep and bear your arms when you go to the mall or to the 7-Eleven? When you go to, if you're a teacher at a preschool, at the library, do you have that right? And some people interpret the Constitution as kind of saying that. How about the idea of arms? what does arms refer to? Does arms refer to bazookas and semi-automatic weapons, or does it refer to hunting weapons? What about infringed? What does it mean to have our right infringed upon? Does that mean we can't delay anybody getting a weapon? So anybody who wants one can get one, because we don't want to infringe upon their right? Does it mean that we should let anybody, regardless of their ability to shoot, have a gun? Does it mean that we shouldn't do any sort of background checks on people because that infringes upon their right to bear arms? Lots of ambiguity. And if you've watched political debate about this, and people refer to the Second Amendment, there's always people bringing up these various ways of interpreting these words and phrases. So how do you deal with this? How do you deal with claims that are so ambiguous? If somebody says, "I'd just like a regular haircut, please," not enough information for a barber to know what to do with your hair unless they've cut it before. If somebody says Charlie rents his apartment, not enough information to know if Charlie is the owner and the owner's renting out his apartment, or if Charlie is the tenant that's renting it from somebody else. Not enough information. When somebody says we can't accept anything less than total victory in Iraq, well, what does total victory refer to? How do we know when we are done with a mission if it's not clear what that means? So how do we deal with all this ambiguity? Hopefully it's obvious that what we need to do is define terms. We need to make sure that if we want to be clear, we explicitly say what we are meaning by different words and phrases, right? So when we are writing, if you want to be clear in your writing, you want to define terms and ideas. If you are making an argument and you want to make sure the person you're speaking to understands what you were trying to say, you want to define terms. When you are trying to inform people of an argument and trying to sway the people, and it's important to you that they understand what that means, you have to define terms. Okay?